2, clear takeoff, left hand. Takeoff left, it is 3 points. Left land, swim west, copy. Crossing 24. Crossing at 24 is
Welcome to the Blueskies podcast. I'm Anchit Gupta, your host and your guest for today's episode. Hello everyone, my name is Anchit Gupta. As some of you might have come across, I write on the Indian Air Force history, specifically using Twitter more commonly as a medium. Today I'm using this podcast as a medium to talk about a subject that is quite close to my heart. I've often wondered where some of the nomenclature that the Indian Air Force inherited at independence came from, and why specifically that nomenclature. For example, the first war-fighting machinery that existed in the Indian Air Force was called the number 1 operating group. Why the number 1 operating group? It had all the flying assets in the country at its disposal. Why all? It's usually not the practice to put everything in one particular establishment. Continuing, it seemed like number 1 wing of the Indian Air Force, which today resides at Srinagar, was formed after the number 2, number 3 and number 4 wings. Why is that the case? And why of all places is number 2 wing at Pune, number 3 wing at Palam and number 4 wing at Agra? In bits and pieces I had the answers, but never the full narrative and never the full comfort that I knew everything. Over the past few months, I put some effort to try and find those answers. And I'm here today to talk a little bit about that. But let us first rewind a little bit. It was in 1919 that RAF set up a presence in India. At that time, it was called an India Group within a broader command. Before we understand groups, let's just quickly spend a minute understanding the structure RAF followed. RAF was controlled by the Air Ministry in the United Kingdom, and it operated across block structures of a command, followed by a group, followed by a wing, and followed by a squadron. A squadron is one which held the aircraft on its strength. A number of squadrons together made a wing, a number of wings together made a group, and a number of groups together made a command. As RAF looked outside its own borders and found a vast empire, it structured the Dominion Air Forces as commands. So India became a command, Mediterranean became a command, West Africa became a command. However, in 1919, they started off as just a group in India. The main reason for setting up RAF in India were the troubles that the British were facing in the northwest frontier province with the Afghan tribes. It was a costly battle for the army, trying to get into those difficult valleys and terrains and using artillery in very difficult places. The Air Force was considered a very cost-effective medium, and that is how the RAF entered India. By 1928, they had improved their structure considerably. It was a command now, called the India Command, which shuttled between Shimla and Delhi in summer and winter. They had set up one group at Peshawar, and that group was called the number 1 India Group. And it had a few stations and a few squadrons under it. The IAF was not yet born. By 1933, when the Indian Air Force finally had its first squadron, nothing much had changed to the structure. A few squadrons here and there, a few stations moved here and there. By 1940, when World War II was knocking, the RAF in India found itself almost present only in the Northwest Frontier Province. The only station outside of Northwest Frontier Province they had was Ambala, which was a training base in Punjab. Therefore, it was woefully away from where the action was, in the east of the country, and it had no presence whatsoever. The action started in 1941, but before we jump to that, I must quote Michael Pearson, who in his book The Burma Air Campaign 1941 to 1945 describes the past 22 years of operation very succinctly. He says, and I quote, "In India, the RAF always had been the poor relation of the army, dependent on the Indian military budget for funding and subject to army tactical control over operations that amounted to little more than flying outdated aircraft to support ground operations against restless tribes. Consequently, air headquarters had very little to do beyond rubber stamping army instructions." December 1941 had two very important developments driven by Air Ministry. The number 221 group, which was operating at Rangoon so far, was moved to Calcutta within the jurisdiction of Air Headquarters India. And it was put in charge of all fighter and bomber squadrons in that region. A few days later, in December 41 itself, number 222 group, which was at Ceylon, now called Sri Lanka, and was in control of all RAF units and flying boats in the Indian Ocean, was also put under the control of Air Headquarters. Air Headquarters so far had not been beyond Ambala. In 1942 March, Sir Richard Edmund Charles Pearce took over as AOC of Air Forces of India. Air Forces of India now defined to include Indian subcontinent and Ceylon. The Pierce era, as I like to call it, over the next 18 months or so, altered the course of India and the air forces in India. The pace at which he went about doing work was nothing short of shocking. The first thing he did was to integrate India into the global RAF setup. Remember the 1928 group called the number 1 Indian group at Peshawar? He quickly renamed it to number 223 group. Its role remaining the same of managing Northwest operations, but now it was part of the global network of RAF. He also realized that the 221 group, which was managing fighter and bomber operations in Burma, was too large an area for them to manage, so he split the role. The fighter operations moving to the 224 group, which was formed in April 1942, again at Calcutta. Having taken care of the key risks areas of northwest and northeast India, Pierce set his eyes on the rest of the Indian peninsula and the ancillary functions which were equally important. A number 2 Indian group had been set up at Lahore in 1940 but had remained dormant, no real action for it to see. In April 1942, a number 225 group was formed at Bangalore in southern India to take care of the air defense of southern India and the whole of the coastline all the way from Bengal in the east to Karachi in the west. The number 2 group, Indian group, was subsumed within the number 225 group. To support these 5 operating groups, number 221 to 225 now spread all the way from Northwest Frontier Province to Ceylon in the south and to Burma in the east. He created number 226 group in May 42 at Karachi to overlook supply and maintenance, and number 227 group in June 42 at Lahore to overlook all training across his entire command duration. In a period of from December 41 to June 42, Indian Air Force or Air Forces in India by then had created 7 groups. I'd again go back to Michael Pearson, who puts this phrase aptly. In this short space of few months, the ramshackle cushy billet referred to as Air Headquarters found itself dropped uncomfortably into the hot seat of the state-of-the-art industrialized war, in which the army would rapidly come to appreciate that it quite literally could not operate without air support. But Pierce was not done yet. His perhaps boldest move was to create a new air headquarters in Bengal at Barakpur, and he did that without a formal permission for Air Ministry. His logic was very sound. Sitting in Delhi, he was 800 miles away from the action in Burma, and for communication and command, he felt it was important to create not an advanced HQ, but a headquarters that could take independent charge of the two groups in the area, number 221 group and number 224 group. Air Headquarters Bengal reported to him, but had fair amount of autonomy. This did ruffle a lot of feathers and there was a lot of movement with Air Ministry, but ultimately the move was approved. And Air Headquarters Bengal was born. Command within a command. Pierce would end up doing this later again. By the time Pierce ended his tenure as AOC in Sea India, or Air Forces in India, he had changed the shape of India. Apart from the groups we had spoken about, the scale of infrastructure development was tremendous. Broadly around the time when he took over, there were 16 airfields in India. By the time he left, there were close to 300. That was the scale that had taken place. The Indian Air Force in the same time, which was just about one squadron strong when Pierce came in, had now grown to 7 squadrons, most of them operating under number 223 group in the Northwest Frontier Province or the number 225 group taking care of southern India. However, some of the initial Indian Air Force officers, such as Mukherjee, Awan, and Majumdar, were now beginning to get a taste of staff postings with the group 223, 225, and even with Air Headquarters. In fact, Wing Commander Mukherjee became Wing Commander Operations at Air Headquarters between November 42 and August 43, almost 3/4 of the tenure that Pierce was there. This would have been a tremendous experience for him, which would have been handy for him later on when he became chief. Before we move on to the next phase, I'd just like to spend a few seconds on this map, which reflects an administrative control of all of the Indian subcontinent, all the way from the Northwest Frontier Province to Assam and to Ceylon. It's a beautiful structure of how 7 groups have combined to cover the entire region, which was not done in the 22 odd years prior to 1940. It also included 2 groups which were functional, and we'll come to that why that is an important. Pierce, though, was not done with India. By the time his tenure ended and the structure was put in place, the air forces in India boasted of about 35 operational squadrons, with 18 of them with the 221 and 224 group facing the Japanese offensive in Northeast. But this was still not considered enough. Despite this frantic pace of development, in barely 18 months, it was just not enough. And so the allied effort had to be brought in. Air forces from US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, they were brought in. It was an hour of need. The Japanese had to be stopped. To manage this expansion of forces, a new command and governance structure had to be put in place. And what was created was the Southeast Asia Command under Lord Louis Mountbatten as the Supreme Allied Commander, and an area that spanned the vastness of India, Burma, Ceylon, Malaya, Northern Islands of Sumatra, and even Siam. Well, the Southeast Asia Command needed an air command, and so was formed Air Command Southeast Asia, ACSEA in short, as it was known for the rest of its existence. Not surprisingly, it was Air Chief Marshal Richard Pierce who found himself in the hot seat as AOC in C of this command moving from India. Once again, he ushered in a series of organizational changes. He created two base commands under him, again the command and command structure. The first was called the HQ Base Air Forces Southeast Asia, BAFC, and the other was called the Eastern Air Command Allied. Both of these reported directly to him. His seat was now Colombo at Ceylon, and so the 222 group, which was controlling all operations in Ceylon and the Indian Ocean, he kept a direct charge of. Later, the 229 group would come up in Delhi, which would be the transport operations of the subcontinent, and he would keep direct charge of that too. But let us return to the two big commands he created. First, the Base Air Forces Southeast Asia. He gave it the responsibility of controlling the 225 group that was operating southern India and all the coast from Karachi to Bengal, the 226 maintenance group, and the 227 training group. It also placed under its charge Air Headquarters India. This was a serious demotion for Air Headquarters India, which all of a sudden, from managing 7 groups, was relegated to managing just one group, the 223 group, operating in Northwest Frontier Province. In accordance with the reduced role, the head of this command was now Air Vice Marshal. Air Vice Marshal Merritt Thomas took over as its AOC in March 44. Air Headquarters, though, retained the sole role of mentoring the Indian Air Force. The other command created by Pierce was the Allied Eastern Air Command. He used the Air Headquarters Bengal to be put under this, and therefore 221 group and the 224 group. This particular command, though, was renamed as the 3rd Tactical Air Force because this command also had working alongside it the US forces. Over a period of time, this 3rd TAF or Tactical Air Force ended up adding a few more groups. A 228 group for administration, a 230 group for maintenance, and a 231 group at Calcutta for strategic air ops. Air Marshal Sir John Baldwin was put in command of 3rd TAF for over a year between late 1943 and late 1944. It was during this period that most of the Indian Air Force units would end up having a tenure in Burma, and it was under 3rd TAF and 224 group, the fighter ops group in Burma, that they would end up operating. By the end of the tenure of Air Chief Marshal Richard Pierce in November 1944, in the 2.5 years that he had been in the subcontinent, he had created an organization with 11 groups, all the way from 221 to 231. This was his legacy, tail that we were operating in. But the war was coming to an end. On 1st of June 1945, with the war front narrowing, the US withdrew from the Southeast Asian Command, and it moved to a phase of military management. And a revision of sorts to the pre-Southeast Asia Command era was on the cards. It was at this time that the planners in India went down to deciding what is it that the post-war organization in India should look like. They had to look at various financial constraints and look at the threat perceptions. The post-World War II threats in India were perceived to be Northwest Province at one end, where the tribes were still relatively active, Bengal at the other end, with its recent experience with the Japanese, and the southern areas along the coast. However, the coastal areas were considered less risky. As a result, it was decided that 20 squadrons would be sufficient to manage India, 10 of these being Indian Air Force squadrons and 10 of these being RAF squadrons. Interestingly, a split of them suggests a good mix between transport, maritime, light bombers, and fighters. None of which eventually fructified, but that's a story for some time later. What was also expected was for the Indian Air Force or the Air Forces in India to have a strategic reserve capability of handling 18 RAF squadrons, which could move in from the Middle East or the UK if the need ever arose in India. The trunk route that used to be the transport route in India was also of strategic importance, and it was important to keep it open. In line with these changes, two major organizational developments were implemented effective 1st April 1946. BAFC HQ, which had been formed with the Southeast Asian Command, was abolished, and it was placed entirely under Air Headquarters once again, reverting Air Headquarters to its full glory that existed during the Pierce era. Air Headquarters now was jointly managed by the Indian government and the Air Ministry. Even more intriguingly were changes that were being made at the operational level. A strategic call was made to have the groups in the Air Forces of India co-located and having the same boundaries as the army commands. This had so far not been done. Perhaps the experience of the Southeast Asia Command was at play. In that era, as you would remember, there were functional commands and there were operational commands, and geographical boundaries of the two often overlapped. In fact, always did overlap. This led to significant communication challenges. Add a third dimension to it, the army commands or the naval commands, which were operating in isolation. And therefore, it was decided that the air forces in India would now, going forward, be based on the army command geography and headquarters. The Indian Army was structured across four commands. One was the North or Northwestern Command, managing the Northwest Frontier Province broadly. The second was the Central Command, managing the area between Lahore and Lucknow. Then was the Eastern Command, managing all the area east of Lucknow. And then was the Southern Command, which was managing all the peninsula of the Indian subcontinent. There were 11 groups, and therefore it was decided to consolidate all these 11 groups in India into these four groups with the army commands. The easiest was the number 223 group at Peshawar, which incidentally found itself being renamed back to its earlier name of number 1 Indian Group on 15th August 1945. It was meant to move to Lahore to be headquartered with the army command, but that is a move that never happened. The number 225 group, which was so far in charge of operations from Karachi to Bangalore and the Indian subcontinent, southern subcontinent, was renamed as number 2 Indian Group. While its headquarters remained at Bangalore, it was expected that this headquarters will move to Pune when the Southern Army Command moves to Pune, which was expected to be very shortly. Around the same time, the number 227 group, which at that time was at Agra, was made the number 4 Indian Group. Agra was the seat for the Central Army Command. And finally, the fourth was the number 228 group, which was at Barrackpur, and it was redesignated as number 3 Indian Group in May 46 and was expected to be the parallel of the Army's Eastern Command. The number 221, 224 and 231 groups were disbanded. The number 229 group merged into one Indian group. And the number 226 group also merged into the number 2 Indian group. The group operating in Ceylon, which was the number 222 group, was made an independent air headquarters Ceylon and no longer under the charge of India. Similarly, the group operating in Barrackpur, number 230 group, moved to Burma and became Air Headquarters Burma outside the control of the air forces in India. Therefore, by the time we are in July 46, in less than a year of the war being over, air forces in India have restructured themselves into 4 groups, called the number 1 Indian Group all the way to the number 4 Indian Group, have co-located themselves with the 4 army commands and are moving 20 squadrons, 10 of the RAF and 10 of the RIAF, to support operations. Now starts a phase where a few unplanned things started to happen. The first came in July 46 when the army decided to disband its Central Army Command based at Agra. They just felt they could do with three commands, and the areas managed by the Central Command were subsumed into the areas managed by the other commands. India, or the Air Forces in India, had formed the number 4 Indian Group at Agra with the Central Army Command, and therefore they decided to disband this particular group. This group did hold some units, and therefore instead of disbanding, they reduced the number 4 Indian Group to number 4 Indian Wing and retained it at Agra. While it would be number plated or disbanded a few months later, on paper, the establishment for number 4 Indian Wing had been made. This wing would later on become 4 Wing Agra. In effect, number 4 Indian Wing Agra can be considered the earliest wing that the Indian Air Force inherited. By March 1947, this structure was broadly holding. There were 3 groups now, and plans were in place to move as per this. 2 announcements in early 47 and the summer of 47 would have a considerable impact on the planning for the air forces in India. The first was on 20th Feb 1947 when Britain announced the transfer of power to India. The second was in June 47 when the Armed Forces Reconstitution Committee was set up alongside the Partition Council to deliberate the division of armed forces between India and Pakistan. Let's break this up. The first had far-reaching impact. The fact that British were exiting India meant that the entire plan of having 20 squadrons in India could no longer be executed. The RAF squadrons would not be based in India, and only 10 Indian Air Force squadrons would be available. It was at this time that the planners, therefore, were forced to make a complete U-turn of the post-World War II plan that they had come up with, giving up the entire principle of geographical proximity to the army commands. In effect, in a single act, the air forces in India had moved to a purely functional setup. And in that functional setup, they had just 2 groups, one that managed operations and one that managed everything else. Time was of essence. Effective 1st of June, changes were made. The number 3 Indian Group, which was present at that time at Barakpur, alongside the Eastern Army Command, was disbanded. As was the practice with the 4 Indian Group, this was reduced to a 3 Indian Wing. And the 3 Indian Wing, along with a few units that it held for disposal, moved to Palam. And that is how 3 Indian Wing at the time of independence was found at Palam. Parallelly, there was a massive reshuffle ongoing. The 1 and 2 groups and 3 groups were all meant to be independent, fully assimilated groups, but now they were functional. And so units from 1 group which were non-operational were moving to 2 group, and units from 2 group that were operational were moving to 1 group. The number 2 Indian Group lost its 2 squadrons and its station at Pune, receiving in turn most of the latter's training, maintenance and administrative organization. This mention of Pune is important. Let's talk about that. As you would recollect, the number 2 Indian Group was at this time based in Bangalore. However, it was supposed to be co-located with the Army Command, which was in Bangalore but had moved to Pune as was the plan by July 46. In anticipation of this move, RAF Station Pune had started changing its color and becoming a frontline fighter base. Wing Commander Ratnagar, an Indian Air Force officer, was posted in as the station commander of Pune in May 1947. Number 2 and number 8 squadrons were in the process of being moved or had already moved to Pune. Between May and November somewhere, the dates are a little hazy in various sources, Pune, as it was part of the number 2 group, was renamed as number 2 wing, and therefore Pune, of all places, ended up becoming the third wing that the Indian Air Force inherited at the time of its independence in August 47. Like I said, there were two announcements that were made in early 47. The second was the formation of the Armed Forces Reconstitution Committee. On 15 July 1947, the committee ratified that the number 1 Indian group will go to Pakistan and will become the headquarters of the Pakistan Air Force. The number 2 Indian group, however, will be retained in India. This was a blow to India. They had also lost number 1 squadron to Pakistan and now the number 1 Indian group. Both of these would come back, but for now, when independence happened on 15th August 1947, as an higher organization of the Indian Air Force, there were only 5 entities. In the absence of number 1 Indian group, which had now moved to Pakistan, when the Kashmir War started in July 47, unlike anyone else ever, it was Air Headquarters directly that waged the war. And that responsibility at Air Headquarters fell on Group Captain Meher Singh, who was Director of Operations. It was only in November 47 that the Indian Air Force reformed the number 1 group. And this time, it reformed it by calling it the number 1 operational group in line with its role. Meher Singh, promoted to Air Commodore, was put in charge of the group as its AOC and continued to wage the Kashmir War towards its end. On 15 September 1947, the number 2 Indian group was also renamed as the number 2 training group, keeping in line with the functional roles that it was operating in. And a little later in November 47, Air Commodore Narendra took over as the first Indian AOC of the group from Air Commodore C.D. Adams, who had held the position since September 46. Before I end, there's something very intriguing I must talk about briefly. When I looked at the structure of the Indian Air Force post-independence, then Air Vice Marshal Subroto Mukherjee in 1947-48 held the post of SASO, Senior Air Staff Officer, at Air Headquarters. This was quite odd because SASO is typically a position held at a command or a group and not at an Air Headquarters. The reason, as I understand now with all this work, is that Air Headquarters continued to operate to the manning of a command, just like it was a Dominion Air Force. Even though its role was that of an Air Headquarters of a country, its manning was still that. It was only on 1st of Feb 1949 that the manning was changed. And Air Vice Marshal Subroto Mukherjee changed his designation from SASO to Deputy Chief of Air Staff, which is equivalent to the Vice Chief today but was then called the Deputy Chief. Keeping in line with the upgradation of Air Headquarters from a command to a proper Air Headquarters, the groups were upgraded too. So in July 49, the number 1 operational group was renamed as Operational Command and number 2 training group was renamed as Training Command. And that is the history of how the Indian Air Force inherited a structure which was the Dominion Air Force, and how everything that transpired in the 1940s, from the World War to the partition to the British exit, eventually played a role on what we inherited and how it changed.
Well, folks, that's all we have time for this week. Join us again next week. In the meantime, sign up for updates at blueskiespodcast.com. There you'll find links to follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. You can also write to us with your comments, questions, suggestions, and feedback from the website or to blueskies@prganapati.com. Subscribe to the podcast on any podcasting platform such as Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and even on YouTube. If you like what you heard, share it with your friends, give us a rating in your favorite podcasting app, and write us a review. It will help other people find us. I want to give my thanks to Saurav Chordia for our logo and Prithvik for the music. I want to reiterate that all the views expressed here are personal. and this podcast has not been approved by or reviewed by the Air Force, Ministry of Defense, or any branch of the government. In the meantime, stay safe and Jai Hind.